Hi, I'm Dr. Sunita Iyer, and we are going to discuss behavioral and mental health in the K-3 elementary age population. This work is done in conjunction with the Renton School District and the University of Washington Bothell School of Nursing and Health Studies. Here are our learning objectives for today. We are going to look at identifying the key underlying causes of common behavior seen in school settings, look at the neurobiologic and physiologic foundations for the behaviors, discuss how to cultivate awareness and humility regarding our responses to student behaviors, distinguish our mindsets and how we see and address behaviors with discipline, and start to think about how we would translate our mindset shift to practice in schools. Here are our content areas for today's presentation. We're going to discuss what's happening in a kiddo's brain when they're actually experiencing behavior in a classroom and when the teachers are having to manage that behavior. Looking at adverse childhood events and the impact of trauma in kids' lives and their behavior, and also an introduction to mindfulness. So let's dig right into it. Let's start with the theories of development. A lot of what we know in terms of childhood behavioral health and mental health and how we approach childhood behavioral health is based in what we think is normal psychologic and physiologic development for kids. These theories of development have been devised over the last century, but many of them are actually quite outdated. Many of these theories of development were actually developed in the 30s and 40s, so are now nearly 100 years past their original development. And many of these accepted theories of development are also, from a cultural perspective, incredibly Eurocentric, and also what we would consider middle class in their expectations, meaning that the way that we assess what is normal for kiddos is based in these theories of development that are nearly 100 years old and don't necessarily take into account the way that our world has shifted in the last 100 years in terms of industrialization, technology, globalization, geographic shifts, and certainly the level of diversity in terms of international populations, in terms of families of color, and in terms of urbanization and the shifts in rural populations as well. So the way that our world looks, the way that our school-based populations look, and really the way that normal looks in our school-age population has really shifted significantly in the last 100 years. Yet, we still use these same theories of development to determine what is normal for kids, and therefore also determine what is not normal. So the way that we decide to evaluate a child's behavior in the classroom, or anywhere really, but specifically for the purposes of this discussion in school-based settings, is based on what we think is normal. And the way that we decide to apply discipline in these settings is also based on what we think is normal and therefore abnormal. But all of these designations don't necessarily take into account the way our world has changed, and certainly doesn't take into account the way that culture and globalization impacts what we think is normal. So let's take a look quickly at a scenario. If you are a teacher in a classroom and you have a kiddo walking around the room poking other students as they are working, think for a moment, what is your immediate reaction? How are you inclined to think about this student? What is your immediate impulse in terms of how you want to manage that situation? What is your immediate response in terms of whether or not this is normal behavior or whether or not this is abnormal behavior? What questions would you have? Potentially, how old is this kiddo? Is this free time? Is this time where they're supposed to be doing a focused activity? So take a moment to consider how you think or how you would approach this particular situation and how you would respond to this kiddo. And next, let's think about our models of thinking. So now, having taken into account that one of our primary models of thinking is based in these outdated theories of development, what are some ways that we apply these theories of development and that way of thinking in terms of discipline and responding to behaviors that we see in the classroom? So there's a couple of different models that we can look at here. Keep in mind that these common models are influenced by the theories of development, but also that these theories of development have some very distinct racist inequitable, and classist underpinnings. So, given that our models of thinking are based in these inequities and disparities, how can we evaluate our models of thinking, and how can we evaluate the way that we actually apply discipline in a school-based situation? So the first way to look at this, or one model of thinking, is the compliance model. Many of us, no matter the situation, whether we are parenting or in a school-based situation, are thinking about behavior, undesirable or desirable. That's our first assessment. If the behavior is undesirable, we want to end the behavior and ultimately impel that child to behave in a way that is desirable. We want to gain their compliance. So essentially behavior, change in behavior, come into compliance. But keep in mind that our compliance model of thinking is based in these theories of development, which we've already discussed, have a lot of inequitable, racist, and classist underpinnings. That's one way to think about how we approach kids in school-based settings. Another way to think about our models of thinking is the management model. So there's a behavior, and rather than simply applying disciplinary action immediately, we think about how would we negotiate with this student or with this child to get them to behave the way that I decide is desirable or is desirable for the function of a classroom. So we use potentially positive reinforcement and or negative reinforcement. We come up with a plan depending on how old the child is and their ability to actually understand and negotiate their own behavior. Potentially we come up with limits to their behavior. If you do this again, then there will be this other consequence. The end point of that model is still compliance. We've decided that whatever behavior we're seeing is undesirable. We want a desirable behavior to happen, and we want the child to comply with what we consider as desirable and helps with the function of the classroom. And those are our two major models of thinking, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with them. That is the way that many of us were educated, trained, and raised, and the way that we have been trained to also think is the best way to run our classrooms. But how could we look at this a little bit differently if we keep in mind that these models are based in theories of development that are inequitable? How could we become investigators or detectives, and how could we start to shift our thinking and therefore our actions to actually include equity into that process? So one of the ways that we could do this, and we'll get into some of these topics, is thinking about ACEs and adverse childhood events. Another way that we can do this is to think about trauma-based education and being trauma-informed educators. And a third way to think about this and to shift our models or our mindset is to consider social dimensions of health. So really what we're thinking about when we shift our mindset is to understand that there are other reasons why kiddos are showing up in the classroom as they are, or with the behaviors that they're presenting to us in that moment. And that it's not necessarily about desirable, undesirable, but that kiddos don't necessarily always have the ability in those situations to shift their way of behaving because there are so many other influences beneath the surface. And what we'll get into next is to understand what are the neurobiologic influences on behavior. How do things like adverse childhood events, how does trauma, how do social dimensions of health shift the way that the brain functions such that kids' behaviors aren't necessarily chosen. They aren't doing it on purpose to disrupt the classroom or to be out of compliance or to be undesirable, but that their neurobiology is ultimately competing with them and their ability to make a different choice. So that even something like a compliance model where we want to get the right behavior or we want to negotiate with a kid isn't necessarily even possible in those situations. So what we'll do next is to learn about and understand what's happening in a kiddo's brain and what's happening with their neurobiology. How is this affecting the way that they show up in a classroom or a school-based setting? How is it affecting the behavior that we're seeing and trying to manage? And how is it influencing their ability to make choices, to negotiate, to actually choose to be in quote-unquote compliance with what we consider desirable behavior or not? Let's take a look at this last scenario before we move on to our next topics. So we have a student who steps away from their work and purposely disrupts classmates instead of choosing an alternate activity. So let's think right now with our shift in mindset, what could be happening for this student? And how would we apply our 3 different models to this particular scenario? If we are trying to gain compliance, meaning create a desirable behavior, what would we do? If we are thinking from our management model standpoint, how would we negotiate with the student or make a plan for behavior that brings them into compliance with what we want? And if we're being investigators or detectives, what would we need to know? What would we need to understand about how this kiddo's brain is working or how other influences in their lives are changing their ability to actually make different choices or show up with a more desirable behavior in our classroom? So give those models and this scenario a few moments to consider, and then we'll move on next to learn a little bit more about neurobiology and how kiddos' brains are working when we're working with them in the classroom.